Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm Lilley, from Technology and Family. That was a really, I like the phrase there about the aerospray can, because a lot of these things that we talk about are often aerosprayed onto presentations, into our thinking about us perhaps critically understanding what they're about. So I'm going to use phrases, but please, you know, I mean, I'm not sure if we're in a forum where you can hurl things at me right now, but afterwards, you know, ask me questions, challenge me about some of these things. The phrases that we use, but they're just words. We're obsessed in our professional circumstances with terminology, and I think we need to constantly interrogate what we actually mean by some of these phrases. But my day-to-day job is I work for a housing association called Romford. We operate across the West Midlands. And I've been invited partly to talk a little bit about our experiences around asset-based thinking, but also about my own personal experiences, professional experiences over the last 2 years doing some research into asset-based community development, both for National Housing Federation, which is an umbrella for housing associations, and also a fellowship called the Claw Social Fellowship, which is a leadership program I'm part of for people that work broadly in the social sector. I'm going to talk a little bit about our current thinking, our current models of practice, generally often described as deficits. I'm going to talk a little bit about deficits, try and unpack what we mean by that. I'll talk a little bit about assets, again a phrase we use and try and unpack what we mean by that. In particular methodology or practice, philosophy you could describe it, called ABCD, which is asset-based community development. Talk a little bit about the future and how that could be implemented and how it has been implemented for God knows how long in lots of places around the world. And some maybe practical steps in your own circles, in your own professional circumstances, how you could potentially apply it. So here we are at crossroads, half empty, half full. I mean, to me, this type of idea, asset-based working, is for many in this area not necessarily new. I think it's something that we've always perhaps been aware of. For me, professionally working in housing, one of the first experiences that was a bit of a professional awakening for me was working in the asset and void team in a housing association. And it was quite incredible. So when you say the word assets to a housing association, I mean the physical properties in which we work and how we manage them and maintain them. And I was working in a void team where I was essentially helping people set up businesses and transfer their skills into things that they could do locally. I overheard a void officer chasing someone for rent on arrears, and it was quite incredible how this void officer was chasing this person for rent, and was oblivious to this individual until this person gave the reason for why he was falling into rent arrears, because his business was struggling. And out of nowhere, this void officer switched from professional mode into personal mode because he too had run a business, and he started to give him practical advice about how this person could turn his business around. It was an incredible moment which made me realise, and that particular professional, this person they were chasing for rent arrears, this person that seemingly was a deficit, was actually full of ideas and potential. So here we are, the half empty, half full. It then made me realise professionally, my God, how much schooling have we had to think in this deficit way? I mean, it really goes way beyond just our professional development, it goes back to school. We've been taught from a very early age to think that we need to be filled with the answers and specialisms and things that other people can bring to us, be it a patient in a GP relationship, be it as a parent, watching the birth of our next child, whatever our professional relationship is with services, it's generally framed in this deficit way. It was quite an awakening for me in that circumstance to really realise that, and it's not something that we can just overnight switch and shift away from. It's ingrained in our learning, it's ingrained in the way we think about the world professionally. Another experience a few years ago, when I was huddled together with lots of community organisations across Birmingham, and we were standing in front of a particular economic principal officer, and he had the most incredible map he just created, which had this entire area of Birmingham covered in red splotches, which were essentially these areas of deficit. Phrases like super output areas, phrases that we're all sort of familiar with, but I think most of the public wouldn't even know what they mean because they don't really mean anything. We use this phrases, this language, and this whole map, this whole area that he created was an area we hadn't even stepped into because it was an area we worked with, working in, even living in, but it's not an area that we necessarily associated with these blobs and red marks. It was an incredible, again, awakening for me that made me realise perhaps we're framing the things that we're trying to address in the wrong way. The systems that we live in, be it the NHS, be it adult social care, be it housing, are essentially built on this deficit cliff. Most of our services operate right at the bottom, be they A&E urgent care, be they picking up the pieces in broken families. We're right at the bottom, constantly picking up people that fall from that cliff. Asset-based thinking and the things I'm going to talk about are way before the cliff. And I've realised over the last few years I've just been right at the bottom here, constantly addressing things, needs, problems, trying to be of service, but essentially not really making a big difference. And I think at the moment, the NHS, adult social care, we're at this point where we're realising it just isn't working. And actually, we're making things worse. I've realised in the last few years in doing the research that we've created a system which locks people in need, which locks people into the boxes that we create. It's not our fault. I think most people in this room, we're here to help people, to do good. But I think there comes a point when you realise actually in the process of doing good, we might be actually doing more harm. Start stepping back and actually looking at how we're delivering services, yes, but it's also about how we think. Is it the wrong thinking? The way in which we look at people and trap them in these ideas, perhaps the system is broken. I think the system, I think a lot of people, particularly working out social care, I think the system's been broken for some time. It's certainly this image here is an image I really like, and it's from a study that Birmingham City Council just recently commissioned called Turning the Welfare State Upside Down. I really recommend finding it out. It was written by the University of Birmingham. And this particular image apparently was in France, and it was a train. The myth goes, I'm not sure if it's completely true, but I like the myth anyway, which is essentially a train carrying paperwork for public services in that part of France, and it couldn't stop because the paper was so heavy and it just came right through the train station. It's a great image, and I think lots of people that work in this space kind of think it's aware that it's broken, but we're kind of on this train and we don't know how to stop, and we're kind of railroading through the issues that we're trying to address. So that's deficits, that's some of the systems, and that's some of my professional awakening over the last few years that's made me come to a point of realisation that perhaps things need to change. How we phrase things, how we approach issues. When you just think of a neighbourhood, especially after you studied that map earlier, what do you think when you say a poor neighbourhood? What are the things that are thrown up when you look at your community? The way in which we start is the way in which we think is the best way. We look at the needs, the issues, addiction, child poverty, homelessness, mental illness, crime, unemployment. These are the things we're set up to solve, to address. And these are the things that we define the areas that we work in by. Again, I think we're earnest, we're not attempting to do that, we're attempting to, I got in this job to reduce inequality, which I believe is unfair and unjust. But I've created this horrible picture that then is locked in my head, and then when I go to these neighbourhoods and speak to people, I can't see them beyond this poverty, beyond this inequality that I've created. There are real issues in these areas. That's not, I'm not saying that those issues aren't there. What we're saying is the way we're framing the debate is perhaps not helpful to addressing them. Asset-based thinking, for me, is a big shift. It is a big shift. It's something that can't happen overnight, as I say, and it's not something that you can just aerospray onto something that we want to do, into a strategy. It is a big shift. It's not easy. But nonetheless, there are people around the world that I've discovered over the last few years, last year in particular, and there's a particular movement that's been created over years of study and analysis that has been addressing this deficit model, this deficit problem. And if you just Google asset-based development, you'll find incredible amounts of information out there on people that have studied this area, looked at this area. One particular guy is called John McKnight, who's a particular founder of this stuff in a university in America, where he went out with some colleagues years of having done community development and then really looking earnestly at the areas that he was working in, I think, God, I've actually made a difference. And he went out with colleagues to kind of look at these areas, understand these communities, and came up with some broad concepts framed by this very simple proposition that every single person has abilities, capacities, gifts that actually are essential. They're there, even if we don't think so. Even if we look at people and think, oh God, they're hopeless, they need us, they're struggling. People have things within them, and our role is essentially to tease them out if they're not getting out. Our role is to give them a platform. So he looked at some of the core areas and created this kind of concept, which has since become, as I said earlier, prolific all across the world and in the UK. Community assets and the things he describes of, I mean, I guess when you say the word, you can start to conjure up some images, but his particular definitions are skills of local people, things that local people are already doing unbeknownst to services, the power of local associations, so connections that people are forming, and right now people are forming communities online all the time, people are forming communities just to solve certain things, but they're happening all the time below the radar. The resources that we all have as sectors, I mean, again, it's a big shift in the way in which we operate, because we operate in silos, and that's reality. We've got our own very complex systems that only we understand. We don't have the time to talk to the system next door. But there are resources when we do start talking together that are prolific across the divide. The physical and economic resources of local places, again, a big thing that John McKnight studied was the just incredible local trade, the local physical places that people actually have, be they in faith communities, be they in schools, across the board. There are spaces that are often locked for various reasons that could be unlocked. So this kind of sort of sense, this philosophy was kind of created, and I formed a particular thing about asset-based community development, but I think, I don't claim to be a practitioner of this stuff, but if you talk to practitioners, they wouldn't claim to be experts either, and I think this is the thing. It's a broad methodology, a broad philosophy that can be delivered in lots of different ways, with some core principles at the heart of it. Asset-based community development has a number of things that practitioners look at. And one of the key things is finding the connectors in communities. These are individuals, people who are outside the system often, that live in areas often, that are just natural conversation starters, that are natural connectors, that are people who just create networks without even thinking to get things done often. And they're there all the time, often unbeknownst. Asset mapping, again, a big thing. The purists amongst ABCD would say you shouldn't do a needs analysis. It's quite a profound thing to kind of accept in our service world, not doing a needs analysis. The idea behind that is that when you ask someone's strengths, you naturally reveal their needs, you reveal what they're lacking for asking what they have. I'm sorry if I would go as far as that, because I think there is an importance to recognise inequalities and get to the sense of them, but I certainly think there's an equality that could be struck when we do joint students, these assessments, for example, when we're looking at the strengths at an equal footing. Identify themes. One of the big things that asset-based community development do is be led by the community as to what the issues are. Have a broad question as to what are the concerns that people have, and giving them the trust and capability to come forward with ideas, instead of us professionals jumping in and coming up with the solutions. Connectivity, building connections between these silos is a big thing. One of the big things that often happens in ABCD is this idea of match funding, giving people the resources to test their own ideas and go off and experiment. There's a big example, there's lots of examples across the UK. There's one in Gloucestershire that I really recommend looking at called You're Welcome, which has been set up by and very much funded by the CCG, the Health and Wellbeing Board in Gloucestershire. A really exciting project. It's been happening over the last 2 years, which implements ABCD principles across the county. A really exciting initiative on a website called You're Welcome, which they've created. For those of us that need metrics, that need things, it's important not to frame this in a cost-cutting way, and that's why I haven't started and framed this in a cost-cutting way. But there has been significant research about the savings behind a lot of this stuff. Particularly one called the Help Project, which was funded by Department of Health, which was the health empowerment community project. So that found significant savings in community development approaches to health and wellbeing. There are lots of things that we've already been doing which touch on some of this, and personal health budgets, again, is part of this kind of philosophy, these principles. But I think, as my colleague said earlier, we can become a little bit zombified in how we use these phrases often, and call it this sort of zombie practice. We need to critically ask, are we doing enough within these pilots, within these things that are giving people control? Is it signed up to this philosophy, or are we just doing it because we think we need to be doing it? The big thing for me is partnership working. I mean, the amounts, ABCD is very challenging, it's very complex, and it requires a lot of partnerships signed up to doing it. It's very difficult to do ABCD just say for a particular disease, or ABCD just for a particular area. It requires real collaboration, people at the centre of it. Loads of stuff to research. I would just suggest, if you're at the beginning of this journey, just go out and find out what's been happening around the world and locally of similar people on similar journeys. Nurture Development is a great organisation to look at. Local area coordination and the Inclusive Neighbours is another fantastic programme of work. And the likes of Community Catalysts that you might have been aware of, that do, again, seeding people's enterprise ideas, following people's strengths and capabilities. And again, I'm absolutely happy to have a conversation further about some of these things, and perhaps we'll be around in a break to have a further chat. Thank you.